So, to the business at hand. Following what I think was a wonderful discussion yesterday by Brenda of Christian poetics, we had the good fortune of sharing a further discussion over dinner, and the number of sort of Christian and Islamic resonances that were emerging already at that point were just fascinating to think about. And so with that in mind, it's just my great delight to introduce our second plenary speaker. One of the goals that I've had as director of the PMR conference has been to bring people who should be talking together and don't often have the chance to together. And among those, I count scholars of medieval Judaism, medieval Islam, classical Islam, and medieval Christianity. And so I wonder if we might be thinking about starting with a conversation about Christian poetics, hearing a bit about Quranic poetics today, and so begin to think about what's a scriptural poetics look like, and is that even the right term? But to offer us some thoughts in at least the first direction, if not the second, is Michael Sells. After spending over 20 years teaching right down the road here at Haverford College, Michael is now the John Henry Barrows Professor of Islamic History and Literature, and a place that I'm quite fond of, the Divinity School of the University of Chicago. He's author of several books, many will know, Mystical Languages of Unsaying, and Approaching the Quran, but that's just two. His interests are wide. The scope of his interest is wide. And above all, I know I was just speaking, I had email correspondence a few weeks ago with Amy Hollywood, who's a former student of Michael's, and we were just speaking. She spoke to me of the ways in which Michael has just always been a generous teacher and colleague. So a great scholar, a generous teacher, and a good colleague. I present to you Michael Sells. Yes, absolutely.
I want to thank Kevin for your generous introduction and for this marvelous conversation that's been set up over the last 2 days, and to thank all those whose talks I've been able to attend and who have participated and asked questions. It's been an extraordinarily moving set of discussions. And I want to thank especially Brenda Dean Schildgen for her extraordinary talk yesterday. I was saying to Kevin that it's just such a joy to hear a talk that has that amount of intellectual and literary excitement carried through at that level. And it really, I think it's a wonderful way to set a number of issues on the table that I'll just be discussing today, not by any design, and not that I went back and redid anything in view of Brenda's talk, but I will make some comments. I imagine most of you have probably heard the talk, but just in case, I'll make some comments about it just to fill in the gaps during my presentation. And I'd like to leave plenty of time for discussion. So Kevin, if you could give me some signals. I'm really bad at timekeeping, so just raise your hand when there's 10 minutes left to go in my talk, please. And if I go beyond that, you got to be tougher than these moderators at debates and stuff. Just get out the big thing. And okay, thank you.
I can be tough. Just let me know.
All right. So I'm going to start out by talking about spirit, desire, and inspiration in the Quran and Arabic and other Islamic poetic traditions. Let me begin by some comments that the Quran made about poets. Alam tara annahum fi kulli wadin yahimun. Don't you see that they are wandering lost, or wandering love lost in every wadi? Wa annahum yaquluna ma la yaf'alun, and that they say what they do not do. إِلَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ وَذَكَرُوا اللَّهَ كَثِيرًا وَانتَصَرُوا مِنْ بَعْدِ مَا ظُلِمُوا سَيَعْلَمُ الَّذِينَ ظَلَمُوا أَيَّ مُنْقَلِبٍ يَنْقَلِبُونَ. Except for those who believe and do right, remember God continuously, and come to victory after they have been oppressed. Those who have oppressed them will know what kind of reversal they will suffer. So here we have a statement that seems very critical of poets at first. It says they're wandering love lost in every wadi. They don't do what they say, except for those, and this is common throughout the Quran, except for those who believe and do right, do good works. But here it's more extended, and to shorten it, who struggle against oppression and overcome it. And it reminds me of something that Brenda was mentioning about Dante, how Dante had this lyricism, but was also said that he didn't want to fall to the sirens, to the siren song, and so that the lyricism in the Divine Comedy had to be brought together with this prophetic voice, this voice of action. And that's something one sees in the Quranic discussion about poets. It's common to say that the Quran had a low view of poetry, but many, I think, poets in the Arab tradition would look at this and say it's just a description of what we do. We do wander love lost in every valley. And that's the theme I'll be talking about today as part of what poets do. The Quran also makes distinction about poets speak from desire, hawa, whereas Muhammad receives a revelation that's revealed. And it's clear throughout the Quranic texts that people had come to Muhammad and said, first of all, to have powerful speech in the environment that we know of from the Quran and from anything else we know about that period of Arabia, to have powerful speech was to be taken with great seriousness. And so people came to Muhammad and said, you must be a poet, because the speech of the Quran was so powerful. And the Quran makes several special digressions to say that poets speak out of hawa. This is a revelation revealed, and we'll talk about some of those passages. In the developed vocabulary of pre-Islamic poetry, The poet did not author the verses. The author of the verses were the jinn, the equivalent of the muses. The poet became possessed by the jinn, who composed the words that the poet would enunciate. Jinn were associated with love, madness, and poetic inspiration or possession. And the three were seen to have gone together. Another point, the Quran makes a point of talking about the revelation to Muhammad and saying, your friend, Sahibukum, is not Majnun. He is not, the word is translated as crazy or mad, but it literally means to be taken over by the jinn. He is not jinned in that sense. So the Quran defines itself carefully as not being poetry. And at the same time, it's clear that the Quran is, by all notions of poetic language, a deeply poetic text. It operates on an extraordinary level of what we might call poetic features that cannot be translated into normal prose. I'd just like to give a few that I've talked about in more detail elsewhere. It is not poetry in the sense that it is not constructed in strict meter, the quantitative meters of classical Arabic poetry, or strict rhyme. It uses a very supple rhyme scheme, and the lines can shorten or lengthen. Classical Arabic poetry was each line had to be the same as another line, like Homeric epic. The Quran, the line rhymes can vary from short, very, very rhythmic, hymnic type quality, to break out into very long lines, into a more homiletic, even more expository discourse, suddenly twist back into the more rhyming incantatory style. The modern poet, one of the most important modern poets of the last decades in the Arab world, the Syrian poet who writes under the name of Adonis, has written that for modern poets, the tradition of the classical poem and the Quran are the two key inspirations, and he finds that the Quran is the element of freedom and musicality and a certain kind of liberation or openness, whereas the classical poetic form offers a sense of shape, a sense of tradition, and a sense of discipline. That's one particular theory, but I think it just shows how contemporary poets today are viewing the poeticity of the Quran. So one of the things that's always difficult to do is talk about the Quran's musicality and its poeticity without using the word poetry or music. The Quran is not poetry, and I often give interviews where I go out of the way to talk about how the Quran is poetic, but it's not considered poetry for the reasons I just mentioned. And of course, those are lost. And then there's a little blurb that says Sells gave a talk in which he said the Quran was great poetry. And of course, that phenomenon makes it all the more difficult for Arab and Muslim writers to talk about the poetic elements. And they are central to understanding what is called Ijaz al-Quran, which is the notion that the miracle that Muhammad had was the Quran. The Quran has several representations of people coming to Muhammad and saying something along the lines of, okay, so you say you're a prophet and you're bringing the words of God. Moses was a prophet and he had miracles, and the Quran recounts them. He throws down the staff and it devours the Pharaoh's magic, and Jesus had miracles, and the Quran pronounces them. He made clay birds come to life. He raised the dead, etc. Where's your miracle? And the answer the Quran gives is, this is the miracle. If any human being can create, and the Quran is, Muhammad is not a prophet, and the Quran is not the word of God. But if no human being can create anything like it, then that's testimony in itself. So this notion, which is called ijaz al-Quran, the inimitability of the Quran, becomes a central authority for the Quran. The Quran's authority is in what is called the nizam, the construction, the beauty, the inimitable way that the language and the meaning of the Quran come together. Not only is the Quran then a theologically self-conscious act of special creativity in language, but it's also learned in that way today, and according to all the traditions, this is the way it was propagated at the time of Muhammad and beyond, as an oral tradition by Quranic reciters who undergo extraordinary training, even till today, to pronounce it in rules that are called tajweed, the rules of recitation. And these involve what called the most, as far as I know, the most elaborate rules of poetic elisions that can be imagined. Every consonant, depending on what comes before it and what comes after it, can be pronounced in one of several different ways. And little skips can be put in or should be put in. Vowels should be elongated to either twice their normal length or 6 times their normal length under certain circumstances. And if one does not do those things, not only is one not actually articulating the Quran properly according to the rules of tajweed, but it is actually quite jarring to people if one is a Quranic reciter. Personal experience, I was in Damascus, and I went to a shrine there of a Sufi named Nabulsi, and I heard this beautiful Quran recitation. And I was with a friend, a Tunisian friend, and we went in and asked if we could sit in with the sheikh. He was reciting. There were young boys there, 8 or 9. There were people like mechanics who drove all the way across Damascus or took buses all the way across Damascus after work to learn tajweed. There were about 15 of us. You know, the sheikh would give lessons on how to pronounce these various elisions. He would recite a verse, and then we would recite after. He would call on us. We would tremble, and there was a young man who sold all his property to come from Nigeria and dedicated 10 years of his life to learning how to pronounce the Quran. And what we found was, first of all, it doesn't matter whether you're Arab speaking or not. Native Arabic speakers have no big advantage. The Quran, most of the Arabic language gloss over phonemes, switch phonemes around, cut off the grammatical endings, so the Arabs are having just as much trouble as us non-Arabs, and none of us are getting close. And when we make a mistake, it's like scratching the chalkboard. There's this total sense among the audience and among people that these things are really clear. You can hear when they're done properly and know when they're not. And when something is at that level of immediacy, I think it shows that the orality of the text and what I would call aspects of its musicality and poetics are absolutely central to the way people take it in and what I would call take it to heart today. So that really means that translations in English, not only is there a kind of doctrine that it can't be translated into English, although there have been some exceptions we heard about today, or into other languages, and there's a hesitation to use translations for that doctrinal reason. I think there are also reasons, even as a translator who knows that nothing can ever be translated completely and that poetry is always impossible, there are special problems in translating the Quran that make it, just different. I'm not saying that confirm the miraculous nature of the Quran, as I was accused by some anti-Islamic websites of saying. I'm just saying that when one has a sense of it, it gives a better understanding of why the notion of inimitability of the Quran, its self-validating nature as a source of beauty and power, is something that that makes at least a plausible suggestion that people might take up. That is not, I don't think that's available in the translations. The Quranic poetic aspects include what I call sound figures. Sound figures would be grammatical endings, interior rhymes that come together in ways that often break down or shatter the lexeme of the language, its notion of separate words, and often bring together all the female grammatical ending, ha, is very similar to a lot of the expressions for sighing or being impressed as an interjection. And it's also related in the Quran in extended rhythmic patterns to a whole series of things where you can take a word like Hawiyah, which is a word, there's a whole surah dedicated to the Hawiyah, which is one of the apocalyptic surahs. And the ends are malaha, qalaha. So that the ha in will say it, or what is with her, etc., the female grammatical endings on the one hand, and this ha within Hawiyah. In the analysis I've done, they've come together and they create a matrix of meaning, and then they resonate into, that matrix of meanings resonates in other places in the Quran, not in that surah. We were talking today about the creation images and the notion of rule, and I'll talk about how this sound figure works in that way. Like many languages, but not English, Arabic works according to grammatical gender. Everything has to be either male or female, with the exception of about 8 words, one of which is the word for spirit. So a table is male or female, etc. The earth is grammatically female. The sun is grammatically female. And in the surah of the sun, you have a whole series of female grammatical endings. The soul is grammatically female, that build up with one another and that create what I would call a partial personification. That there's a sense of more than simple grammatical gender. It's as if the Quran shaped the power of the grammatical gender into something beyond it, but not into a pure personification. So when I translate it, or anyone translates the Surah of the Sun, or the Surah of Zelzala, the earthquake, when the earth will reveal her secret and bear forth her news after people say what is with her. All is the language of birth, giving birth. Ma laha is something people would say today. What is with her? What's wrong with her? Etc. It sets up a partial personification. The commentators have noticed it, but they often downplay that gender dynamic for I think theological reasons. It winds its way through the Quran as these partially personified male and female energies that are throughout the Quranic voice. So one of the things I find is that the sound and the meaning in the Quran are so intertwined that it becomes really difficult to talk about one without the other. My second part is about Quranic spirit, ruh. There are 3, the word spirit or ruh cognate with Hebrew ruach, appears in the Quran only about 20 times, but always in very, very charged places. There are three contexts. The first context is creation. The stories about the creation of Adam, God shapes the clay or the mud. In the Quran says, in the divine voice, with my own two hands. And then God breathes of his spirit into Adam, nafakha, to breathe out, min ruhihi, and that instantiates the creation. In prophecy, the ruh appears in very similar ways. So the story of Muhammad's prophecy, the surah that's often one of the most well-known surahs in the Quran, the surah of Surah Al-Qadr, the night of fate or the night of power, which is, it grounds the observance toward the end of Ramadan of the night of power. That surah brings up the ruh and the gender dynamic and the gender energies. And I'd like to just go through the Arabic and show why translations cannot deal with this. I'm not a trained Quranic reciter, so it's not going to sound right, but I can do my best. Inna anzalnahu fi laylatil qadr. We have sent it down on the night of destiny. Or we have sent him down on the night of destiny. The who, the male neuter pronoun, male/neuter, can be either he or him. If the exegetes choose him, then people say that's Gabriel, Jibreel. If they choose a who, then they say, well, that's the Quranic revelation, it, the book or the Quran. وَمَا أَدْرَاكَ مَا لَيْلَةُ الْقَدْرِ. What could tell you what the night of destiny is? This is a phrase that appears throughout the Quran, مَا أَدْرَاكَ مَا. What could possibly tell you what something is? And usually what the Quran does after that is give a kind of riddle or something. It doesn't really tell you what could tell you what it is. مَا أَدْرَاكَ مَا لَيْلَةُ الْقَدْرِ. What can tell you what the night of power or destiny is? Laylatul Qadri khayrun min alfi shahr. The night of destiny is better than 1,000 months. Then we have a break into the long rhythm. Tanazzalul malaikatu waruhu fiha. The angels come down. The spirit among them, or the spirit within them, or the spirit upon her, or the spirit upon it. Bidni rabbihim min kulli amr. By the permission of their Lord through every kind of command or order. So this central phrase, waruhu fiha, it forms a sound figure with numerous other passages in the Quran talking about this moment of revelation. The her or it, what is that? Grammatically, the most logical place that it would go back to would be the night, Layla. That's feminine. So, and the night, the angels come down in the night, fiha, in it. But there are other possibilities that I won't go into at this moment. Then it ends this way. Salamun hiya. Salamun hiya. Now, you're probably all familiar with Salamun alaikum, peace be to you. Salamun hiya is an unusual expression. Peace she, or peace it is. depending on whether you want it gendered or non-gendered. Hatta matlal fajr. So if one reads it in the gendered way, there's a masculine being being sent down upon or within the feminine being, or at least grammatically gendered night of destiny. And then in the end, there's this extraordinarily, this phrase in an extraordinarily powerful and unusual position, salamun hiya. And if one reads it without the gender, it's all, it came down on it or during it, peace it is. And I always find that there's a choice between over-personifying things and translating them as he and it, or what I would call neutering the text, where all this powerful gender dynamic is stripped away. Third section. Now I'd like to talk about two modes of understanding Revelation that were clearly in tension with one another throughout this period, not only in Islam, but all the other traditions. That is the notion that revelation comes down or is sent down to the prophet, and the notion that the prophet goes up to retrieve the revelation. Oh, before I do that, I just have to say the one thing. So I had the rule in creation and the rule in prophecy. And then there's the rule as the Yawm ad-Din, the day of judgment, the day of reckoning. So you have three what I would call boundary moments where the rule is central. Even the phraseology and the sound patterns come up in the same way, often subtly reversed. So in prophecy, the angels come down with and the Spirit in the night or on the night of destiny. At the Yawm ad-Din, the angels rise up with the Spirit at the day of reckoning. But the patterns and the sound patterns are extraordinarily similar. So in each case, the Spirit, there are three primordial moments of Spirit. They each encompass one another. They appear as kind of beginning, a prophetic encounter with that eternity, and final announcement. They're implicated in one another, and they by the sound patterns that bring them together. So it's really hard to hear the sound patterns of one without hearing the sound patterns of the other. So the coming down notion, the angels come down. We have sent it down. That's the coming down notion of Revelation. And then there's the legend or the Hadith about Muhammad's Mirage. There's no discussion at length about the Mirage in the Quran. There's a vague statement that God took his servant by night from the sacred place of prayer to the furthest place of prayer. People said that was God taking Muhammad from Mecca to Jerusalem, Al-Aqsa, the furthest. But that is all that is elaborated in the Hadith, which elaborates a miraculous journey of Muhammad from Mecca to Jerusalem, or from Mecca through the directly up through the seven spheres to the divine throne, and then from what scholars have said, a kind of more compilated notion that Muhammad goes first to Jerusalem. There he tethers his mount, his magic mount, Barak, and then he rises up with Gabriel through the heavens to the divine throne. In order to make, and what the Quran does is it takes passages about different parts of the Quran, about the moment of revelation, and the Hadith place it in, of the Mirage, place it on the ascent, Muhammad's ascent. One classic example, the kind of text about the Quran's talk about prophecy and its own process of prophecy, is the following. I'll read it in Arabic and then give a gloss. وَالنَّجْمِ إِذَا هَوَى. By the star when it falls over the horizon, according to many commentaries. مَا ضَلَّ صَاحِبُكُمْ وَمَا غَوَى. Your friend has not gone astray, and he is not deluded. وَمَا يَنْتِقُ عَنِ الْهَوَى. He does not enunciate from hawa, from desire. إِنْ هُوَ إِلَّا وَحْيٌ يُوحَى. It is only a revelation revealed. عَلَّمَهُ شَدِيدُ الْقَوَى. That a powerful being has taught him. ذُو مِرَّةٍ فَاسْتَوَى. Nobody knows what this dhul mirratin is for sure, but the commentators talk about different ways of its primary power and strength of this being. Fastawa, and it took its place on the throne, is what the term means in other contexts. But is it referring to the angel? Is the angel taking his place on the throne, or is it God? Is this a reference back up to God? Most people talk about the angel as being the powerful being that taught this to Muhammad. But if it's talking about the angel, then we have something that occurs in the Jewish Metatron tradition. So someone's occupying the throne, and you don't know who it is. Is that the angel? Is that God? Is that the reflection of God? Is that someone assuming the power of God? Are people that think they see that being on the throne deluded or not deluded? وَهُوَ بِالْأُفُقِ الْأَعْلَى. While he was at the furthest horizons, highest horizons, the heart does not lie in what it saw. مَا كَذَّبَ الْفُؤَادُ مَا رَأَى. Then there's another section. He saw it in another descent, Nazlatan Ukhra, at the low tree of the furthest boundary, Sidratul Muntaha. Therein is the garden of refuge or sanctuary, Jannatul Mahwa. When there came over the low tree, what came over it? إِذَا يَغْشَى السِّدْرَةَ مَا يَغْشَى. The gaze did not swerve, and it did not transgress. مَا زَاغَ الْبَصَرُ وَمَا طَغَى. He saw the signs of his Lord, the greatest signs of his Lord. So, in these cases, you have this moment of revelation and a vision, but what is being seen? There are terms there. There's a low tree. There's a furthest garden of sanctuary, but it's completely enigmatic. And then it said the low tree was shrouded by what shrouded it. So the explanatory term reverts back on itself to give you no information, almost as if the language were subverting its own ability to talk about it. And this is, of course, God's language, so it would probably be something God wanted to do, not presumably difficult. The Mirage tradition takes these things like the Jannatul Mahwa, the Garden of Sanctuary, the low tree, and all these different things that we saw or didn't quite see in this vision, and it places them on different stations of Muhammad's journey to the divine throne. And you have different versions saying, there in the fifth heavenly sphere was the low tree. And you have some versions that say, no, it was in the seventh sphere. Now, this tension between descent and ascent can be seen pulling through the rabbinic and Hekkelot Jewish traditions. It can be seen pulling through some of the early Christian traditions. It's in the Enoch tradition, some of which are clearly Jewish, some of which there's discussions about whether they're Christian glosses over a Jewish tradition. And it's clearly there in all the Mirage traditions and in the Quran itself. One of the things that this tension about rising up through the heavenly spheres reveals, I think, is, and especially the way we can see the tension refracted among the three Abrahamic traditions and seeing it developing. And I think it's hard, if not impossible, to start tracing influences. One could say the Mirage legend is, seems to be following patterns that were set by earlier texts about Enoch rising through the spheres. One could say that some of the Hekkelot literature, whose provenance and dates we don't know, may have been influenced by some of the early Mirage traditions. His teacher Bruno Latini had a copy. This was first suggested by a Spanish scholar, Asín Palacios. There was this huge reaction against it for what Maria Rosa Menocol calls philological nationalist purposes. The notion that if we were influenced by one of them, they must be the more powerful and the most cultural, and we're the weaker party. And that notion of influence, I think, is still contaminated by notions of active partner and passive partner. The way I look at it is that these contacts were going on continuously. That you had a Christian world, a Jewish world, an Islamic world that were part of two large political realms, one ruled by Christian leaders and one ruled by Muslim leaders. But Jews, Christians, and Muslims were active builders of those two different civilizations. And those traditions were moving around much more subtly than we can find in written texts, and it was certainly far more pervasively than maps that would say, here's the boundary, would ever show. That doesn't mean that those who reflect traditions that are found in the others are necessarily being sympathetic. It's clear that what Palacios showed, even as early as 1914, is some of the very tortures in hell that Muhammad sees on his journey when he goes down through the lower levels. The logic of the torture is related to the crime, and some of the exact crimes and exact logic appear in the Divine Comedy. Whether the Christians or the Muslim traditions that came up with that first doesn't really matter. I think what matters is that you have a shared cosmology. You have a shared cosmology in which the heavenly spheres, the Ptolemaic universe, is both astrological, physical, and symbolic. The two are not separable. People this was a common heritage, and each group tried to give the version of that story that made it their own, and often this went back and forth as things developed. One of the things that you see in these is another tension, that's within each of the traditions, between or among three different ways of viewing prophecy and salvation. I call them the angelic, the humanistic, and the intellectual. And there are certain cues, I think, that are quite easily recognizable. If the controllers of the spheres, or the heavens, are intellects, as in Aristotle, and if the ascender has to pass intellectual tests and show gradations of intellect, and ultimately rising to meet the active intellect, or however it's viewed, which is Gabriel. The philosophers saw Gabriel as the active intellect, and the lowest of the divine intellects in the Quran, in the Aristotelian tradition. That's the intellectual tradition. If the angels are in control of the spheres and angelic, then that's what I would call a spiritualist version. If human prophets are in the spheres, and the person rising up is not only not becoming more angelic, but is actually in a ferocious competition with the angels, and the human being is privileged and wins out, I call that the humanist version. The ferocious, we think of angels as kind of nice cherubic figures. They were really not, they were really quite scary. And, whether one is talking about the cherubim, we talk about cherubs now, but the cherubim were not something you wanted to get too close to in the biblical tradition, or and there were equivalents in the Islamic tradition. So, and there's what I call the fee-fi-fo-fum moment. There's both in the Jewish traditions, the rabbinic traditions, the Hekelo traditions, and in traditions of Mirage and Sufi Mirage, there's an angel that says something. Well, at one point he says, I can smell a human being from 365,000 parasangs. And so then all of a sudden he confronts, whether it's Muhammad or Enoch or whoever it says, and what are you doing in the pure land? You, and then often there's a rant about you mortal being that spills blood and that has pus and all this kind of we are the angels, we are light. Word fee-fi-fo-fum, of course, is what the giant says when Jack and the Beanstalk is rising up. And I'd forgotten, what does it rhyme with? And it's a fee-fi-fo-fum, I smell the blood of an Englishman. And I was thinking, I wonder if that comes from an Irish tradition or something. The Mirage is clearly in the human category in the sense that in each level there's a prophet, usually starting with Adam, ending with Abraham. And in each case, the angels challenge Muhammad and say, what are you doing here? And there's a word coming, he's been called for, he's been sent, or he's been chosen clearly by God. The next section, poetic notions of lyricism and prophecy. Here I need to read some poetic verses to give a sense of how this would work. Let me start out by reading some verses of poetry that is attributed to the pre-Islamic period and to the very, very early Islamic period. But as I do, let me acknowledge something. I view early histories of religions somewhat the way I would imagine scientists view trying to find the origin of a galaxy. The closer you get to the black hole, the more your instruments are being warped by the power of what's happening. And the closer you get back to the origins of these traditions, the more the whole environment has been so pervaded and changed that it becomes very difficult. What we think is pre-Islamic poetry, what is said to be pre-Islamic poetry, what is said to be the Quran, and the traditions of Muhammad were all collected and written down long after at least 100 to 150, in some cases 200 years after the fact. It was all passed down by oral tradition. And so that the process of developing the science of Arabic, developing a grammar, developing the script, developing categories of analyzing the meters of the poetry, analyzing the Quran. Often the books about the Quran were also books about poetry. They'd say a verse from the Quran. They said, well, how do we know what the Arabic is? Here's a verse of the poem. And then, bless their hearts, they're saying, we're only reading this poetry because we have to understand the Quran. They'll go on to maybe 30 or 40 pages, digressing on the poem and all the great things of the poem. Then they'll say, it's like, oh yeah, back to the Quran. So the collection of the poetry, the collection of the Quran was part of the same extraordinary endeavor that occurred over centuries. So when I say pre-Islamic or when I say Quranic, I don't take any position on exactly what happened. 10 minutes? Thank you. So a couple poems, I'll mention them, I'll sum up, and then let's have some discussion. So here's the first poem I'll read. This is from Labid, who is said to have lived to the time of Muhammad. It starts out with the core lyrical moment in Arabic, which is the remembrance of the recognition of the traces of the campsite of the lost beloved. And in the early Arabic poetry, there was a convention where everybody understood that you didn't have to say what happened. The lover and the beloved were separated. Maybe they were different tribes that would come together at spring campground season or for pilgrimages. They would break up, the love affairs would be ended. And then the voice is always of the lost, the lover yearning and remembering the beloved and the happiness time was spent with her and her absence. The name places are going to be the stations of the beloved. So the lover remembers the stations of her leaving. These stations, maqamat or manazil, are also the terms that are used for stations on the pilgrimage. And there's almost a ritual quality about the remembrance. The tent marks in Minan are worn away where she encamped and where she alighted. Gal and Rijam left to the wild. And the torrent beds of Rayyan, naked tracings worn thin like inscriptions carved in flattened stones. So often the traces of the beloved's campsite are like marks made around a tent to keep a trench to keep flooding, or the tent marks that were made. And the erosion wears them away, but somehow it also reveals them. There's some kind of dialectic going on. Dung-stained ground that tells the years past since human presence. Months of peace gone by, months of war. Then there's something that happens throughout Arabic in the Quran and the poetry, where the past and the active invocative are the same kind of word. So, replenished by the rain stars. It can be, let the rain stars replenish, or it can mean it was replenished by the rain stars. Replenished by the rain stars of spring and struck by thunderclap downpour or steady fine drop silken rains from every kind of cloud passing at night, darkening the morning or rumbling in peals across the evening sky. The white pond crest is shot upward, and on the wadi slopes, gazelles among their newborn, and ostriches, and the wide of eyes. This is one of many epithets. I try not to translate epithets as nouns because the whole point is that there's no noun. So you put it together like a cubist painting or something, you get these epithets. But just a cheat, it refers to the Dorics with the very wide eyes, and it's a common feature. Silent above monthling fawns, on the open terrain yearlings cluster. The rills and runlets uncovered marks like the script of faded scrolls restored with reeds of pens of reed, or tracings of a tattoo woman beneath the indigo powder, sifted in spirals, the form begins to reappear. I stop to question them. How is one to question? Deaf, immutable, inarticulate stones. So this questioning of the ruins, the questioning of the stones, the word for the stones is khawalid, which can mean the blackened hearthstones on which the cooking pot was kept in the camp, and it also has the word of eternity within it. You question them. They are signs of the beloved. They are signs of her presence. They are signs of her absence. You question them, they will never give you an answer. But questioning them is crucial. And the moment of the poetic voice is what I would call the moment of recognition. The moment that the poet stops to tell his companions, there's something about this old campsite, I have to get down and look. And they're like, what's his problem? And he gets down off the camel and he's gazing at this, and then there's the moment when these aren't just any traces in the sand. This is the trace of the lost beloved's campsite. That moment of recognition then is, it's often called the moment of dhikr or remembrance. That moment unleashes the flood voice of the poetic expression. I'd like to read one more quick version from early Arabic poetry, then a later poem from the medieval tradition, 12th century, and then take your questions. This poem is by Dhur Rumma. Maya is the beloved. To the encampments of Mirage be over you still, and the rains of the Pleiades pouring down and spreading, though it was you who stirred a lover's disheartened desire, until the eyes shed tears, yes, that nearly, on knowing a campsite as Maya's, if not released, would have killed. I'll just recite that little bit in Arabic. Amenzilate mayin salamun alaykuma ala na'i wa na'i yawaddu wa yansahu. Wa ma zala min naw' as-samaki alaykuma wa naw' ath-thuraya wabilun mutabattahu. Wa in kuntuma qad hijtuma راجي الهوى لدى الشوق حتى للت العين تسفه أجل عبرة كادت الإرفان منزلة لمية لا لم تسهل الماء تذبه. Then he goes on, though I was already nearing 30 and my friends had learned better and good news had begun to weigh down folly. Yeah, I'm too old to be falling in love like this and weeping over abodes, etc. When distance turns other lovers, the first premonition of loving Maya will still be with me. Nearness to her cannot impoverish desire, nor distance, wherever she may be, run it dry. The inner whisper of memory, reminiscence of Maya, is enough to bruise your heart. Desires have their way, circulate freely, but I can't see your share of my heart given away. Though in parting some love is effaced and disappears, yours in me is made over and compounded. You came to mind when a doe aerial passed us, right flank turned to the camel mounts, neck lowered, a doe of the sands, earth-hued with white blaze on the forehead and the forenoon sun clear upon her back. She leaves her fawn on a dune, a grassy dune in Mushrif, the glance of her eye gleaming around him, gazing at us as if we intended harm where we would meet him, approaching us, then backing away. She is her like in shoulder, neck, and eye, but Maya is more radiant than she, still more beautiful. In conclusion, what happens in the Nasib, or the remembrance of the lost beloved? You have a invocation of the beloved at this moment of recognition, a recognition that is so powerful that it were not for the burst of tears, it would have killed the person who makes the recognition. In the Quran, if Moses had looked at God when God said he would unveil his face, he would have been obliterated like the mountainside around him that was. And actually in the Arabic poetic tradition, Moses is one of the great lovers, because Moses was willing to even ask to go through this experience. And there's often the boasts about the poetic lover. The poet is Majnun. The poet is crazy. The poet is everything that the Quran says it's not. A Majnun Layla, the figure that comes to be, that inspired through the Persian version, Eric Clapton's Layla, and not to mention a million other poets throughout history, is known to wander about the wadis, love lost in every wadi. He sees Layla everywhere. He sees a rock, he says Layla. He sees a tree, he says Layla. His friend says, don't try to help him, he's too far gone now. He perishes in the desert for Layla. He is annihilated. And in that annihilation for Sufis, that becomes the moment when the human soul becomes empty of its own images, and the image of God fills it, and it becomes one with God. And at that moment, Hadith says, God says, I become the hearing with which he hears, the seeing with which he sees, etc. In many of the ways we talked about prophetic and poetic in Brenda's talk. And from Ibn al-Arabi to Hafiz in the later tradition, you can hear this powerful persona. This is the voice that, as one Ottoman poet says, the meanings of reality are made clear in my words, but concealed by them. The very foundations of the earth shake in my speech. So this notion of the poetic and the prophetic as being in this extraordinary situation of parallel but separate, and the very process of writing down the Quran, even though the Quran says all this stuff in the poets, loving women that aren't your wife, drinking wine, all this stuff is forbidden. All this was Jahiliyyah, fighting tribal wars, heroic boasts. They took all this down meticulously, and it was part of the tradition, much the way I think Christians did with Ovid and Virgil. You know, it wasn't supposed to be the right thing, but it became deeply important. So let's take some questions. I do want to read this poem at some point, but I know I've gone probably to my 10 minutes. So shall we read it now, or you're the master here? I defer to you.
Why don't you read it for us, and then we'll have
Okay. So here's a poem from Ibn. This is from a set of poems called Turjuman al-Ashwaq, which can mean translator of desires, interpreter of desires, or biographer of desires. At the rock plains near the bend of the trail is the place of meeting. Kneel your camels, its waters are home. Don't go crying lightning, Thahmud, Hajar, hankering after. Let me just mention that Hajar is one of the stations of the Beloved in Ibn al-Arabi. It's also the name of the town Mada'in Salih, which is where when the people refused to give water to the camel mirror of God and disobeyed their prophet Salih, God destroyed them, and the town became utterly obliterated. And for Ibn al-Arabi, in his commentaries at least, that's the moment of the obliteration of the self in fana, in passing away in mystical union. Don't go, but as stations of Beloved, the voice is, this is the voice of waking up. Snap out of it, man. There's always a voice of, oh, the lost beloved, when she was there, and then the wasteland turns to a garden. And from the pre-Islamic poets right down to the present, the beloved, the description of the beloved, which purports to describe her, her mouth is like wine imported from distant Persia, kept in a stoppered jug for 1,000 years, a vintage as old as Enoch, a vintage older than the creation of the universe, the best vintage ever. All these, kind of long, digressive similes. They don't end up, if all these beloveds, Layla and Maya, and they all came into the room, we say, and they have this description, wasf, the description of the beloved. They all came in, no one would have a clue which one was which. So it sets up this elaborate notion that a beloved is being described. What is often always depicted, I think, by the end is a lush garden. And I think the lost garden is the symbolic analog of the beloved in all these passages. So by the time you get to the end of extended similes, which tell you nothing about the object of direct desire or gaze, you end up with a rich depiction of the flowing garden, the gazelles, the animals giving birth in peace and tranquility, the pond cress sprouting up. Of course, the poet is in the desert. And so here he is living in this garden. And so his friends and his own poetic voice is saying, you're crazy, you're dreaming, snap out of it. You got a long journey ahead of you. People die out here. And so you have the wake up man voice and then the voice of remembrance, and they're always pulling at each other. It often takes the poet 4 or 5 efforts to snap himself out of the remembrance. So here's a kind of snap out of it voice. Don't do this. Then it says, revel like maidens, breast curves alluring, or gazelles that slow to graze and wander. These references to breast curves and all that, it's all out of Quranic discussions of paradise, and people are saying that can't be in the Quran about discussions of paradise. it must be borrowed. There's a book that says it must be borrowed from Syriac texts because it makes no sense. So I'm saying if the Quran and Arabic poetry are at the same time, this is the language the poets had. This was the language of the remembrance of the beloved, and the consolation for the beloved was all about this. While the fly hums softly in the meadow as the songbird's trills reply. Delicate the fringe of the garden, tender the spring breeze, the cloud lit from within by lightning, thunder rumbles the dark sky. Rains burst like tears of a lover, torn asunder from the one he loves. Drink this ancient wine. Drink deeply. Let the spell of its song take you. Wine of the age of Adam, bearing word down the generations from the garden of sanctuary, Jannatul Mahwa. This wine, sweet as a rush of musk, wine I've tasted on the lips, elixir kiss of signoras and signorinas. English doesn't have any good vocabulary if we're talking about married women and female married women. I have to borrow from another language, to talk about, the way it's usually translated from, unmarried maidens and married women or something. It just doesn't work in the Arabic context. So thank you. I look forward to any discussion.
We do have time for questions, for discussion, so please, I invite you to address your questions to Professor Sells directly.
May I?
Sure.
Well, lots of wonderful things you've made me think about, tons of them. My mind is brimming. But let me just, because I would like to ask you, maybe tomorrow we can continue this discussion.
Sure.
I want to talk about the Hebrew poetic traditions and how those also play into this Quranic tradition. So that was the first thing, and that's just for a thought. And then, your basic idea about connection between prophecy and poetry, of course, links the three traditions very profoundly.
Right.
As the prophets and the Hebrew scriptures and Dante, of course, in that tradition. So that's another big thing for us to think about. Now, then you mentioned Dante and Islam, and you trod on my territory there. So I have to still say a few things about that.
Sure.
Because Palacios, early part of the 20th century, Cerulli was ambassador to Persia during the 30s and 40s, and he was absolutely convinced that Dante knew a version of the Mirage. So I do have a question, because there's so many versions of the Mirage.
Right.
There are a number of them in the West.
Right.
There's no question about that.
Yeah.
There's a Latin version, there's a French version, there's a Castilian version. That certainly, my belief about Dante is if it existed, he had read it, because he read everything. He was an omnivore,
Right.
and he would never have been closed-minded about it
Right.
because of its provenance.
Right.
Already it's been translated into Latin anyway,
Right.
and into other Romance languages. But there's a really close connection for Dante, because Monte Croce, who was from the Church of Mirage, in his work that he brought back to Florence. So, and he gave lectures. I mean, Santa Maria Novella was a place for people to come from Dominican, he's a Dominican, so he went there to learn. Dante frequented Santa Maria Novella regularly. So there's no question that he would have come across it through Monte Croce, which is right on top of him. But my question is, these versions in the West, and I have published on a few, are all in prose.
Right.
So it's true you have a lex, lex taliorum, and you have, the Palacios argument was the light metaphysics and all of this. You have light metaphysics in the West, too.
Right.
So, I mean, these are shared traditions.
Sure, of
That's
course.
my
Yeah.
issue here.
Yeah.
But are there poetic versions of the Mirage in Arabic? Because the ones that come into the West are
Right.
all in prose.
Yeah.
There's no poetry in any of them.
Right.
There's similes and
Yes,
metaphors.
right,
But
right.
not,
Yes, I mean, and someone correct me if I'm wrong, but the Mirage tradition grows out of these Hadith. They were in prose, and they're in a prose that is not in the kind of poetic way that the Quran is a poetic prose. It's more of a narrative style prose. And you get a lot of Persian and Ottoman and Turkish versions of Mirage type scenes in people like Farid ad-Din Attar, who was about the time of Ibn al-Arabi, 12th century. But I don't know of any equivalence in Arabic that would take the Mirage as such and put it into a poetic form, although you have poetic refractions of the tropes of the Mirage that are brought in. So as far as I know, there's no Arabic, certainly there's no Arabic model I know of that Dante would have known of that would have been translated into Latin or anything else in any kind of poetic modality. As far as St. Palacios, let me say I think a lot of his argumentation was about the light metaphysics and things. I think that was a stretch. I never found that to be particularly convincing. My point is I don't think it proves, it just proves that I think all that we know from the discoveries of the various versions since that time that you mentioned in the Castilian, the Latin, and the French, I didn't know about this Dominican text, that all of this material was going back and forth, and probably the most interesting connections we won't have the text for, you know. So I certainly agree with that. Back on the Hebrew issue, I think there's some. Let me just mention two extraordinary aspects of it. First of all, this poem by Ibn al-Arabi and the other 61 poems in the Turjuman al-Ashwaq, they're criticized. People saying, you're a religious leader. You're talking about elixir kisses and drinking this wine and all this stuff. You know, and so then he wrote an allegorical commentary on his own poem. You know, saying, no, this is not the real wine, and the elixir kiss is these, you know, and it actually fits into his greater metaphysical writings, his symbolic cosmology and his mystical psychology. It's not completely arbitrary, but it doesn't do any justice to the deep poetic tradition that he's been drawing on, because he knows that would be controversial. And in many ways, I think that his own process of self-commentary is very similar to the kind of commentaries that were written on the Song of Songs. And you see the same kind of commentary traditions on Rumi and Hafiz, and arguments about whether, the same arguments that exist today about whether the Song of Songs is a love of God poem or a human love poem. Those arguments have existed throughout the Islamic tradition. And one of the things I find most interesting is the poems that are most loved are the ones, in many cases, that don't give that away in the poem. They raise the question very provocatively. Rumi says, by God, I drank a wine last night that I won't drink until the day of resurrection. Or it made me so drunk I won't wake up till the day of resurrection. So he said, whoa. And Hafiz says, he is an infidel to love who will not worship wine. Well, not only are you worshiping something other than God, presumably, unless you read it in a certain way, but you're worshiping that which is most polluting and most sinful. So he gets all the scandal in there in one little verse. And actually, a ghazal like this came out by Ayatollah Khomeini and was published in the New York Times in translation. Forget the words of the preacher, get me drunk in the tavern, let me lie on the floor and wallow in the dust. And people are saying, this doesn't make sense. And it makes perfect sense in the tradition. Nobody has a problem with it until the revolution came and the Shah's people accused Khomeini of being like a profligate, and then after that, nobody would talk about this aspect of Khomeini because it became part of the polemic. The other aspect about the Hebrew is that in the golden age of Hebrew poetry, of Hebrew secular poetry, which happened under Islamic Andalus primarily, you have these amazing figures. I have to mention this figure, Shmuel HaNagid. One of these figures that you just can't believe it. It seems to be true. He was the leader of his religious community, the Nagid. He was the vizier for the Sultan of Cordoba. He was a major general who wrote extraordinary odes in the heroic Arabic model to his victories. He was a great love poet in the Arabic tradition. He pioneered, along with others, how to write Hebrew poetry in Arabic-style meters. He invented the metrics for the Hebrew poetry, and he has poems that could be right out of the Remembrance of the Lost Beloved and the Garden, etc. He uses these Bedouin themes, and then he mixes that with the biblical themes, and they developed a way of being both completely immersed in the Arabic poetic tradition, and they immersed it as well in the Bible. And this went on for several generations, Moses Ibn Ezra, Judah Halevi, other great poets. And, you know, it's just one of the remarkable aspects in world history. And you look back at a figure like Shmuel HaNagid, big job. He was a vizier, and he was a scholar who made all these grammatical breakthroughs, revitalized the Hebrew language as a poetic language, and was one of the great poets looking back in the tradition that I'm talking about. So I think that is just one glimmer of discussion about the Hebrew connection. Other questions or thoughts? Oh, there was one back there, I think.
So, in your talk, you were explaining how the Quran has all these stylistic and formal means joining form to context.
Mm-hmm.
You're describing this. Of course, that's not unique to the Quran or Arabic literature. That's pretty common in most traditions, probably all. You know. So my question was, within the Quran, if there are devices, formal devices that are common to either thematic discussions or if they can be traced according to the periods that the Quran was written.
Right.
So the Medina
Yeah.
period, or when the Quran is talking about creation, does it use certain devices? When it's talking about war and battling, does it use certain devices? Judgment. So that was a question. Really.
Great question. Let me say that if we trust the traditional chronologies from the Muslim scholars, where they divide things into Meccan and Medina and early Meccan, late Meccan periods, the early Meccan verses are what I would call the hymnic role. The surahs are short, universal themes. That is, you don't have to know tribal history. You don't have to know the names of the characters that Muhammad was fighting with. You don't have to know any of this historical background to basically read something like, in translation, when the skies are torn from the heavens, when the stars are strewn, when the seas boil over, when the tombs burst open, then a soul will know what she has given and what she has held back. O human being, what has led you from your generous Lord? That kind of hymnic, apocalyptic modality is considered to be the central early Meccan theme, and the creation, the rule passages, and what I would call the sound figures that link them, they're found in all the major periods, and they can occur in the short Meccan style discourse, or they can appear in these longer, more discursive lines in the late Medinan discourse, but they appear in kind of powerful lyrical modalities breaking into the text.
We have time for one more question.
Yes.
I was struck by words of power right? I was struck by how so much of the power is in the sound and the poetic modality. Is it true, would it be true to say that the power of the Quran is revealed much more in the recitation than in, say, exegesis? That exegesis matters less for Arabic theology than recitation, and matters less than for Christian theology, where exegesis is a central activity and recitation of the script of the text is not nearly so central?
It's a wonderful question, and I can't make a global statement about mattering less or more. I think certainly the whole history of people learning the Quran has started with the assumption that to learn it, you have to interiorize it, even memorize it. It becomes kind of part of your circulation, and at that point, then people go on to exegesis. The exegetes do not talk in detail about the kind of things I'm talking about. And I think that protocol is quite interesting. They'll talk about Ijaz al-Quran. It's mostly anecdotal. The Quran was so powerful it made even Omar weep. Omar the great general, etc. They give dozens of anecdotal statements about the power of the sound of the Quran. And they talk about its narrative power and the greatness of its story, but they don't talk about what I would call this poetics aspect in any kind of elaborated exegetical detail that I know of. So I think I just like to leave your question as a great question. We're actually hoping to set up at Chicago a program in comparative exegesis of, because the Quranic Christian and Muslim exegetes were influencing one another constantly, to set up a program in comparative exegesis that might even get close to taking that question seriously and doing something with it. I did want to mention just a couple things that I'd like to say to kind of tie these points together about the Quran and the poetry. Just to kind of give a nod to the unfortunate polemical world we live in today. There was this mention I mentioned of a book that said that the wine and the virgins and the maidens with swelling breasts and the large of eyes, the ayn, and the huris, which is a word in the Quran, hur, which in Arabic means flashing black and white, black against white, and it's usually referred to the captivating. Later, in the polemic now, these are the virgins, and then people say there's 72 virgins that are given as a reward, as a sexual favor for those who carry out suicide bomb attacks. And when this German scholar came up and said, this solves all the problem. First of all, the Quran makes no sense as you read it, because it makes no sense that they would have the Quran talking about all these virgins and wine and all this stuff in description of paradise, because paradise has to be chaste, it has to be, and the idea that there would be erotic love or even sexuality paradise is absurd, and none of this stuff makes any sense in Arabic. It's got to have come from Syriac hymns that were misunderstood by Muhammad, and he changed different words. So he says the word for large eyes really means white raisins, and the grapes are white raisins. So the Newsweek headline said, was all this kind of sarcasm, suicide bombers, juicy virgins or white grapes. And this got around. It was in the Guardian magazine in England, and the statements that were made, this scholar, Christoph Luxemburg, who actually has some interesting things to say, has written the most important work of Quranic studies ever. And this is, people are talking about it on American TV and saying, this will solve the problem in the Middle East. And first of all, they're thinking there's 72 virgins. There's not 72 virgins in the Quran. There's not 70 virgins in the Quran. There's no promise for people that can carry out violent jihad of anything in particular in the Quran. There's promises to people that do good works. All that stuff about the 72 virgins comes in one subset of Hadith, and there's two versions in the scholar that does that, Tirmidhi. One says that these 72 virgins are for everyone, and one says that they're only for martyrs. So he's not even consistent. But everyone assumes they're in the Quran, and but the greatest assumption is that you can't have wine and large-eyed beauties and flashing eyes in a depiction of paradise. That would be crude. And it goes back to an old polemic between Christianity and Islam about whether, a paradise should have any discussion of anything that is, quote, sensual or not. And the assumption that somehow Muhammad would not have had access to any of this vocabulary in the Quran. All the poems I read from the pre-Islamic period had all that vocabulary. They had the wide of eyes. That was that dual oryx eye that I talked about. They had the flashing eyes of the black versus the white. And they, this, and in the poetic tradition, why is that? It's embraced. The poem I read by Ibn al-Arabi about elixir kiss, it's all grounded in Surat al-Rahman and other poems of the Quran. Why would this be embraced by not just Sufis, but across the poetic tradition in Islam? Is there was no disconnect. Because for the poets, longing is infinite. And longing for the beloved is the closest that a human being can come to what the infinite is. Because the human being can describe the beloved, she slips beyond the language. The human being can get close to the beloved. If the human being is with the beloved, he's so out of himself that he can't remember it. If he's not, and if he remembers it, then he's already separate. There are all these paradoxes. She is the cure, she is the disease. This longing that is infinite then becomes a perfect alignment with a kind of longing for the divine source. And the notion that the Quran would have had these aspects of a kind of vision of some kind of vision that instead of occurring before in the past, all that stuff is what the poet remembers. In the notion that somehow there was a problem with the Quran of that aspect never occurred to Muslim scholars. And if the notion that somehow that's all that vocabulary, all those images, all those conventions are wrong or didn't exist, then that means that all of the pre-Islamic poetic tradition was invented. And I say, it's like students say, Homer didn't write Homer, on the lips of the blips. I say, if a bunch of people got together in 8th century or 9th century Aleppo and invented this vocabulary with 10,000 epithets for the camel mare, this elaborate poetics, and then covered up every trace of the invention, that is a miracle that's just as extraordinary as the jazz that we can, at least as humans, see within the Quranic text. So in either case, it's a remarkable story. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Megan.